Hello there and welcome to Secretum Histories. Tonight, we're easing into a story that has been told for thousands of years, though rarely in the form most people recognise today. It is a story preserved not in legend alone, not in imagination or speculation, but in lines pressed patiently into clay by scribes who lived closer to these beliefs than we ever will. Long before modern interpretations transformed ancient gods into cosmic visitors, and long before the idea of a divine war became something dramatic and cinematic, the Sumerians were already recording something quieter, heavier, and far more unsettling. This is not a story that begins with explosions in the sky, or battles fought with weapons we would recognise. It begins instead with order, with structure, with an attempt to explain how authority was meant to function in a universe that had only recently come into being. The earliest tablets do not describe chaos erupting suddenly. They describe balance first, roles assigned, domains respected, responsibilities distributed carefully among divine forces that were never meant to compete in the way later stories suggest. What follows, slowly and unevenly across generations of texts, is the record of that balance failing. If you find this kind of quiet history soothing, you can like the video or subscribe, but only if it genuinely adds something to your evening. This space is meant for unhurried listening, for letting ideas unfold without pressure. Now, settle in comfortably, lower the lights if you can, and allow the world outside to fade just enough to make room for something very old. The tablets we're turning toward tonight do not announce a civil war outright. They never use language that corresponds neatly to our modern understanding of warfare. There are no declarations, no clear beginnings, no formal endings. Instead, the evidence emerges gradually, through disagreements preserved in myth, through shifts in authority that never quite get explained, through punishments that seem excessive unless something larger was already broken. What modern readers sometimes mistake for dramatic storytelling was, to the Sumerian mind, an attempt to document why the world functioned the way it did. In the earliest layers of Sumerian writing, the gods are not depicted as a unified collective. They are structured, hierarchical, and often uneasy with one another. Authority flows downward from the sky god, An, but it does not move smoothly. Power is delegated, contested, and sometimes quietly undermined. Enlil governs the air and the earth below the sky, enforcing order with rigidity and force. Enki operates from beneath, from the waters below the land, solving problems with cleverness rather than command. These are not personality quirks added later for drama. They are structural tensions embedded in the cosmology itself. When the scribes recorded these relationships, they were not inventing fiction. They were explaining why storms destroyed crops, why floods erased cities, why laws felt absolute yet sometimes unjust. Divine conflict was not entertainment, it was causation. A disagreement among gods explained disruption in the human world far more convincingly than chance ever could. Over time, as the tablets accumulate, those disagreements begin to harden into something closer to factional division. The Anunnaki do not appear at the beginning of this story. That absence is important. They emerge only after authority is already fractured, after the divine hierarchy is proven incapable of governing smoothly. In the earliest texts, cosmic management belongs to older gods, figures who established heaven, earth, water, wind, and time itself. The Anunnaki enter later as enforcers, judges, and arbiters of fate. They are not architects of creation. They are administrators brought in after the system begins to strain. This detail alone reframes everything. A civil war in the Sumerian sense does not begin with the Anunnaki rebelling. It begins when the original structure of divine authority stops working as intended. Councils are convened more frequently. Decisions become harsher. Punishments increase in severity. Entire cities are destroyed not because humanity fails morally, but because the gods themselves can no longer tolerate the consequences of their own arrangements. The tablets never describe the gods as omniscient. They argue, they miscalculate. They regret decisions only after the damage has been done. This is especially visible in stories where one god acts decisively, while others respond too late or too cautiously. The flood narrative is only the most famous example of this pattern, but it is far from the first. Long before waters rise to erase the world, the texts show authority being challenged in quieter ways. Some gods withdraw from direct involvement, others tighten control. Enlil's decrees grow more absolute. Enki's interventions become increasingly indirect, constrained by rules that appear to bind the gods as much as they bind humanity. These rules matter. Divine law, once spoken, cannot be undone. It can only be worked around. That limitation alone suggests a system already under pressure, where power is distributed but not aligned. What modern readers sometimes label a war is, in the tablets, a prolonged breakdown. The Sumerians did not imagine gods clashing openly for dominance, because that would imply instability at the foundation of reality itself. Instead, they recorded something more uncomfortable, a universe held together by compromise, punishment, and silence. When one side prevailed, it did not announce victory, it imposed order and moved on. The Anunnaki fit into this moment precisely. They are not rebels, they are not conquerors, they are the mechanism through which fractured authority attempts to stabilize itself. As judges of the underworld and determiners of fate, they absorb responsibility for decisions no single god wishes to own. Death, limitation, and irreversible judgment become their domain. In doing so, they remove those burdens from the visible rulers of heaven and earth. This redistribution of responsibility leaves traces everywhere in the texts. Lifespans shorten, human fate becomes fixed, access to the divine becomes regulated. Where earlier stories allow gods and humans to interact freely, later ones enforce distance. The Civil War, if that term can even be applied, is not remembered as a series of battles. It is remembered as a loss of closeness. The scribes who preserved these tablets lived in a world shaped by those outcomes. They inherited laws they did not create, cities built atop ruins they could not explain, and rituals designed to appease gods whose earlier generosity had clearly diminished. When they looked backward, they were not nostalgic, they were analytical. They wanted to know why divine authority now required constant maintenance, sacrifice, and fear. This is why the tablets never frame the conflict as resolved. There is no moment where harmony is restored completely. The universe continues, functional but tense. Order exists, but it is enforced rather than shared. Humanity survives, but under conditions that feel imposed rather than gifted. The Anunnaki preside over this arrangement, ensuring that fate proceeds according to rules established in the aftermath of divine disagreement. As we move forward, the focus will narrow. The broad structure of divine order gives way to specific incidents, particular texts, and moments where the strain becomes visible. Names repeat in different contexts. Stories contradict one another subtly. Gaps appear where explanation should exist. None of this is accidental. It reflects a tradition grappling with its own past, preserving fragments of a conflict it could never fully articulate. For now, it is enough to remain here, at the point where order has begun to fail but nothing has collapsed yet. The Civil War, as the Sumerians understood it, did not announce itself. It unfolded slowly through decisions that seemed reasonable at the time, and consequences that only became clear much later. And as the tablets continue to speak, that slow unravelling becomes impossible to ignore. In the earliest layers of Sumerian writing, there is no single word that corresponds cleanly to what we would call war. There is no compact term that signals organised conflict between sides in the way later cultures would describe battles, campaigns, or rebellions. This absence is not an oversight, nor is it evidence that conflict did not exist. Instead, it reveals something fundamental about how the Sumerians understood tension, disagreement, and breakdown long before those ideas hardened into the concept of warfare. The oldest tablets approach conflict indirectly. They describe imbalance, disruption, refusal, excess, and correction. They record moments when order does not hold, when authority fails to persuade, when force replaces consent. These texts do not frame such moments as extraordinary events. They present them as natural consequences of a system under strain. To the Sumerian mind, conflict was not a separate category of experience. It was a condition that emerged when balance could no longer be maintained. In these earliest compositions, the universe itself is still settling. Heaven and earth have only recently been separated. Domains have been assigned, but their boundaries remain porous. The gods are not yet distant abstractions ruling from unreachable realms. They are present, active, and involved in the daily functioning of the world. Their disagreements do not erupt into open violence because violence, as a concept distinct from order, has not yet been fully defined. What exists instead is friction. This friction appears first in administrative language. Some of the oldest mythological texts read less like stories and more like records of responsibility. One god is assigned a domain, another is tasked with oversight, a third is burdened with labour. When these arrangements fail, the texts do not describe rebellion, they describe complaint, murmuring among the lesser gods, fatigue, resentment, a sense that the distribution of work and authority is unfair. This is crucial. Conflict in its earliest form is framed as exhaustion rather than aggression. The gods who labour are not angry because they desire power. They are angry because the system demands too much from them. They dig canals, pile earth, shape clay, and maintain the physical structure of the world. Their protest is not framed as treason. It is framed as a problem that must be solved if cosmic order is to continue. The response to this unrest is not punishment. It is reorganization. Humanity is created not as a weapon, but as a solution. This detail matters because it shows that early Sumerian conflict resolution did not default to domination. It defaulted to redistribution of burden. When the system strained, the answer was to add another layer, another class of beings to absorb the pressure. But even this solution carries consequences. Humans inherit labour, but they also inherit proximity to divine authority. They are placed between gods who command and gods who judge. Their existence becomes entangled with divine disagreement from the very beginning. The earliest conflict, then, is not fought between gods alone. It is embedded into the structure of the world itself. As the texts continue, subtle shifts begin to appear. Decisions are no longer unanimous, decrees are enforced more harshly. Where earlier compositions emphasize cooperation, later ones emphasize obedience. This change does not arrive suddenly. It accumulates across generations of scribes, each preserving fragments of older traditions while adapting them to new realities. One of the most telling signs of emerging conflict is silence. Certain actions are described without explanation. Punishments are imposed without justification. Gods vanish from narratives without comment. These omissions suggest moments where consensus could no longer be assumed. Rather than explain disagreement openly, the texts move past it, recording outcomes instead of debates. This pattern reflects a worldview where open divine conflict would be destabilizing. To admit that gods could fight openly would undermine the very order those gods were meant to guarantee. So the scribes record tension without spectacle. Authority shifts without announcement. Power consolidates quietly. In some compositions, a god is stripped of influence without being named as defeated. In others, a domain changes hands without ceremony. These are not narrative accidents. They are careful preservations of memory that avoid framing divine authority as fragile, even when it clearly is. The lack of a word for war does not indicate peace. It indicates discomfort with naming breakdown too clearly. Conflict exists, but it is treated as an internal failure of structure rather than an external clash of forces. The universe does not fracture because someone attacks it. It strains because its foundations are imperfect. This is especially visible in the way councils are described. The divine assembly is not a harmonious gathering of equals. It is hierarchical, procedural, and often tense. Decisions are made through decree, not discussion. Once spoken, words cannot be recalled. This rigidity means that errors cannot be corrected openly. They must be mitigated indirectly. Here, conflict becomes procedural. One god enforces a decree, another works around it. This is not rebellion in the modern sense. It is institutional resistance. Authority remains intact on the surface, while its effects are quietly altered beneath. This dynamic appears repeatedly in the oldest texts. Enlil speaks, and the decision becomes law. Enki responds not by confrontation, but by reinterpretation. He does not challenge authority directly. He undermines its consequences. This pattern is so consistent that it cannot be dismissed as literary flourish. It reflects a deeply ingrained understanding of how power operates when it cannot admit its own limits. Over time, this indirect conflict accumulates. Each workaround weakens the illusion of unity. Each unspoken disagreement leaves residue. The system continues to function, but it does so through strain rather than harmony. The scribes do not describe this as collapse. They describe it as necessity. The earliest tablets, then, present conflict as something embedded rather than enacted. There are no battles because there are no sides yet. There are only roles that no longer fit, responsibilities that no longer align with capacity, and authority that cannot acknowledge its own mistakes. When later traditions look back on this period, they reinterpret it through new lenses. What was once administrative friction becomes moral conflict. What was once exhaustion becomes rebellion. But in the earliest layers, those later interpretations have not yet taken hold. Instead, we see a world where order is fragile not because it is challenged, but because it is incomplete. The gods are still learning how to govern what they have created. Their failures are not spectacular. They are procedural. They are quiet. They are buried in lines about labour, fate, and silence. This is why the earlier Sumerian texts resist dramatic framing. They are not interested in heroes or villains. They are interested in causation. When something goes wrong, they ask what arrangement allowed it to happen. They do not celebrate victory. They document consequence. The absence of a word for war reflects this mindset. Conflict is not an event. It is a condition. It arises when systems fail to account for reality. It persists until new structures are imposed. It never truly disappears. It is absorbed, managed, and redirected. As these texts continue to evolve, language will change. New terms will emerge. Later cultures will name battles, rebellions, and divine struggles explicitly. But here, at the beginning, conflict remains unnamed because it is inseparable from creation itself. The world is young, authority is new, power is still being defined. The gods do not yet know how to rule without friction, and humanity does not yet understand the cost of being created to solve a problem that predates it. These earliest tablets do not shout this truth. They imply it, line by line, through what they choose to say and what they leave unsaid. As the record continues, these tensions will sharpen, roles will harden, enforcement will replace negotiation. The quiet strain preserved here will later be remembered as something far more dramatic. But at this stage, before the word war existed, conflict already shaped the world, steady and unresolved, waiting for language to catch up with reality. Before disagreement hardened into division, before authority fractured into competing claims, the Sumerian texts describe a divine order that was meant to function without conflict at all. This order was not imagined as perfect in a moral sense, nor was it based on equality among gods. It was hierarchical, carefully distributed, and deeply pragmatic. Each divine power existed to perform a specific function, and harmony depended not on goodwill, but on each god remaining within the boundaries of their assigned role. The earliest tablets do not portray the gods as free agents acting on impulse. They present them as components of a system. Creation itself is described as an act of organisation rather than invention. The separation of heaven and earth is not a battle, but a structural necessity. Space must exist for anything else to function. Once that space is created, authority follows structure and remains associated with the sky, distant and overarching, a source of legitimacy rather than intervention. Enlil governs the air and the inhabited world beneath, enforcing order and continuity. Enki operates below, within the waters and the hidden mechanisms that sustain life. This distribution is not arbitrary. It reflects a deliberate attempt to prevent overlap. The divine order was meant to prevent conflict by ensuring that no god needed to interfere in another's domain. Each realm had its ruler, each process had its overseer. Wind, water, fertility, justice, time, death, and birth were assigned carefully, not to prevent power struggles entirely, but to make them unnecessary. When the system worked, the gods did not need to argue. They simply fulfilled their functions. This structure mirrors the way early Sumerian society understood governance. Cities were organized around temples. Authority flowed from divine patronage through priesthoods to kings and administrators. Roles were fixed, duties were inherited. Stability depended on everyone accepting the limits of their position. The divine order reflected this worldview projected onto the cosmos. If the gods themselves required structure to coexist, then human society certainly did as well. In this original arrangement, cooperation was assumed rather than enforced. The gods did not need to be compelled to act in alignment because the system itself directed their behaviour. The concept of rebellion, divine or otherwise, does not appear in these early layers because the framework did not allow for it. To rebel would require stepping outside one's role, and roles were understood as intrinsic rather than chosen. Even divine personality was secondary to function. Enlil is not harsh because he is cruel. He is harsh because the air and storms are harsh. Enki is not clever because he is mischievous. He is clever because water finds paths where force cannot. These traits are not moral judgments. They are descriptions of how natural forces behave when personified. The Divine Council, often referenced indirectly, was not meant to be a forum for debate in the modern sense. It existed to formalize decisions that emerged from necessity rather than opinion. When decrees were issued, they were not votes. They were acknowledgements of what must occur for the system to continue functioning. Once spoken, they became irreversible, because reversing them would imply that the order itself was flawed. This rigidity was not a flaw in Sumerian thought. It was a safeguard. If divine law could be changed easily, then nothing would be stable. Floods, droughts, fertility, and death would become unpredictable in ways that threatened survival. By portraying divine decisions as binding even on the gods themselves, the texts establish a universe governed by consistency rather than whim. Within this framework, punishment was not originally a tool of domination. It was corrective. When imbalance occurred, consequences followed automatically. A city failed to honour its patron deity, and its prosperity declined. A king violated ritual order, and chaos followed. These outcomes were not framed as vengeance. They were portrayed as systemic responses. Humanity's position within this order was carefully defined. Humans were created to relieve divine labour, but they were also integrated into the cosmic hierarchy. They were not slaves in the modern sense. They were functionaries. Their labour maintained the physical world so that the gods could maintain the cosmic one. In return, humans received protection, knowledge, and stability. This exchange was the foundation of coexistence. The earliest texts emphasize reciprocity rather than submission. Offerings are not bribes. They are maintenance. Temples are not monuments to fear. They are points of contact where the system is serviced. Rituals do not exist to appease anger, but to ensure continuity. As long as each part performs its role, harmony persists. This divine order assumes trust, not emotional trust, but structural trust. Enlil trusts that Enki will not interfere openly with his decrees. Enki trusts that Enlil's rigidity will not destroy the system entirely, and trusts that authority delegated will not require constant oversight. The Anunnaki at this stage are either absent or undefined, because the need for judges only arises when rules are broken. What is striking in these early descriptions is how little emphasis is placed on conflict resolution. There are no mechanisms for renegotiation, no appeals, no reversals. This suggests that the original system was not designed with prolonged disagreement in mind. It assumed that roles were sufficient to prevent sustained tension. This assumption works only as long as circumstances remain within expected limits. As populations grow, as cities expand, as labour demands increase, strain begins to appear. The system does not adapt quickly because adaptation itself requires flexibility, and flexibility undermines rigidity. The very feature that ensured stability becomes a source of vulnerability. Still, in the earliest phase, this vulnerability has not yet manifested fully. The gods coexist because they do not yet need to compete. Resources are abundant, humanity is limited, authority is respected, the cosmos functions as intended. The texts preserve this period not as a golden age of peace, but as a reference point. When later generations look back, they do so to understand what was lost, not to romanticize it. The divine order that came first is not presented as idyllic, it is presented as coherent. This coherence is visible in the language used. There is clarity. Roles are named. Functions are explicit. Transitions are explained. Nothing feels rushed or reactive. Decisions flow from structure, not from emotion. As the narrative moves forward, this clarity will begin to blur. Roles will overlap. Functions will strain. Authority will harden instead of guiding. But here, at the foundation, coexistence is not an achievement, it is an expectation. The gods were supposed to coexist because the system required it. Their cooperation was not heroic, it was procedural, and when procedure fails, the consequences are not immediate explosions or open battles. They are slow distortions that take generations to recognize. This original order is important not because it lasted, but because it establishes what conflict later violates. Without understanding how the gods were meant to coexist, the breakdown that follows appears dramatic rather than inevitable. The tablets insist on inevitability. They show a system designed for stability confronting conditions it was never built to endure. As the pressure increases, as responsibilities expand and consequences multiply, the order that once held begins to show signs of stress. Authority must respond, but it can only respond using tools designed for a simpler world. The adjustments it makes will alter the balance permanently. What follows is not a sudden collapse. It is a gradual departure from the original intent. The divine order remains in place, but it functions differently. Coexistence becomes enforcement. Reciprocity becomes obligation. Silence replaces explanation. The structure survives, but its spirit changes. And in that change, the seeds of deeper conflict are already present, waiting for the moment when coexistence is no longer enough to hold the system together. From the moment divine authority was established, it carried within it a tension that could never be fully resolved. The Sumerian texts do not portray power as something that naturally produces harmony. They present it as something that demands constant maintenance, restraint, and acceptance of limits. Authority existed, but peace was never guaranteed by it. In fact, the very structure that allowed the gods to govern the cosmos also ensured that stability would always be fragile. The earliest divine order depended on hierarchy rather than consensus. Authority flowed downward, not outward. An embodied legitimacy. Enlil enforced command, Enki ensured functionality, and lesser gods carried out assigned roles. This arrangement worked only as long as each layer accepted both its power and its restriction. The moment a role became unbearable, or authority began to feel misaligned with responsibility, the system strained. And strain, in Sumerian thought, was never neutral. It was a sign that imbalance had entered the world. Power among the gods was not shared evenly, and the texts never pretend that it was. Some gods commanded, others obeyed. Some decreed fate, others endured it. This imbalance was intentional. The universe, as the Sumerians understood it, required differentiation to function. Equality would have produced paralysis. Hierarchy produced motion. But hierarchy also produced resentment, fatigue, and silent resistance. The problem was not that authority existed. It was that authority was rigid. Once established, it could not adapt easily to new conditions. Decrees were final, domains were fixed. Responsibilities expanded, but power did not redistribute accordingly. Over time, this created a widening gap between command and consequence. Those who bore the cost of maintaining order had little voice in shaping it. This dynamic is clearest in the recurring theme of divine labour. The lesser gods, often unnamed or grouped collectively, are described performing the physical work of creation. They dig canals, raise embankments, maintain irrigation systems, and shape the land itself. These tasks are essential, repetitive, and exhausting. The texts do not glorify this labour. They emphasize its weight. When complaint arises, it is not framed as rebellion. It is framed as inevitability. Authority responds to this pressure not with reform, but with delegation. Humanity is created to absorb labour, not to redistribute power. This solution preserves hierarchy while relieving strain. It works temporarily. But it introduces a new variable into the system. Humans become participants in divine imbalance. They inherit the consequences of authority without possessing it. This is where peace begins to erode quietly. The gods are no longer dealing only with one another. Their decisions ripple downward into a growing human world that reacts unpredictably. Cities expand, noise increases, resources are strained. The consequences of divine decrees become louder, more visible, harder to ignore. Authority among the gods was never stable because it depended on static roles governing a dynamic reality. The cosmos did not remain as simple as it was at creation. Populations grew, environments changed, human activity intensified, but divine structure remained fixed. This mismatch produced friction that authority could not resolve without contradicting itself. The Sumerian texts never describe gods meeting to revise the system fundamentally. There is no constitutional reform of the cosmos. Instead, authority responds with enforcement. Punishments grow harsher, decrees become broader, the margin for tolerance shrinks. What was once guidance becomes control. This shift is subtle but unmistakable. Early myths emphasize cooperation between gods and humans. Later ones emphasize obedience. Rituals increase in number and precision. Laws become more detailed. Fate becomes less flexible. These changes are not framed as moral decline. They're framed as necessity. Power without peace produces a particular kind of instability. It does not explode immediately. It accumulates. Each uncompromising decision creates pressure elsewhere. Each attempt to suppress consequence produces new consequences. The gods are not unaware of this. They simply lack the tools to address it openly. Enlil's authority illustrates this problem clearly. As the enforcer of order, he is bound to uphold structure even when it causes harm. His role does not allow for compassion in the modern sense. When humans become too numerous and disruptive, he does not negotiate. He enforces silence. The flood is not an act of rage. It is an act of administrative correction taken to an extreme. Enki's role reveals the other side of unstable authority. He understands the system's flaws, but he cannot challenge them directly. His power lies in adaptation, not command. He works around decrees rather than against them. This indirect resistance preserves the appearance of authority while undermining its absolute control. Each such intervention weakens unity further. These opposing approaches do not cancel each other out. They coexist uneasily. Authority continues, but consensus dissolves. The gods remain aligned in name, but divided in practice. This is not civil war in the human sense. It is institutional fracture. The Anunnaki emerge precisely in response to this condition. They are not creators. They are not visionaries. They are instruments of stabilization, judges, enforcers of fate, administrators of death. Their rise signals a shift from governance through structure to governance through consequence. When authority can no longer maintain peace, it turns to finality. Judgment replaces persuasion. Fate replaces flexibility. The underworld becomes organized, regulated, staffed. Death itself becomes systematized. This is not presented as cruelty. It is presented as order imposed where order has failed. But this solution carries its own instability. By delegating final authority over fate, the gods distance themselves from the consequences of their decisions. Responsibility becomes abstract. Suffering becomes normalized. Humanity's relationship with the divine becomes transactional rather than reciprocal. Power persists, but peace recedes. The cosmos continues to function, but it does so through constraint rather than harmony. The Sumerians did not imagine this as corruption. They imagined it as the cost of complexity. The deeper issue is that authority among the gods was never designed to evolve. It assumed a world that would remain within predictable bounds. When reality exceeded those bounds, authority hardened instead of adapting. This hardening preserved structure, but destroyed balance. The tablets do not condemn this outcome, they document it. They show how a system built for order responds when order itself becomes burdensome. The result is not chaos, it is a colder, more regulated universe. As the narrative moves forward, the effects of this instability will become more explicit. Punishments will appear disconnected from causes. Divine decisions will feel disproportionate. Humanity will bear consequences it cannot influence. The Anunnaki will solidify their role as arbiters of fate, and the distance between gods and mortals will widen. What began as a carefully balanced hierarchy becomes a system of control. Authority remains intact, but peace becomes conditional, temporary, and fragile. The gods still rule, but they no longer coexist comfortably. Their power endures, but it does so without the ease that once made harmony possible. This tension does not resolve, it deepens. And as it does, the foundations laid at creation begin to shift in ways that the earliest order was never meant to withstand. There is a point in the Sumerian record where something subtle but unmistakable happens. The tablets stop telling the same story in the same way. Not abruptly, not dramatically, and not with any announcement that disagreement has entered the world of the gods. Instead, the fracture appears as inconsistency. Names shift in their importance. Roles overlap where they once remained separate. Events are remembered differently depending on which city preserved the tradition. The scribes continue to write with confidence, but the confidence no longer points in a single direction. This is the first true sign that divine authority has begun to strain under its own weight. Earlier compositions share a remarkable coherence. Even when they differ in emphasis, they reinforce the same structure of the cosmos. Heaven is above, earth is below, the waters sustain everything beneath. Authority descends. Order is maintained through clearly defined roles. These assumptions form a shared framework that transcends individual temples and cities. But as time passes, that framework begins to crack. The fracture does not appear as open contradiction at first. It appears as emphasis. One tablet elevates Enlil as the unquestioned centre of authority. Another subtly shifts influence toward Enki. A hymn praises the wisdom of one god while minimizing the role of another. These are not accidents. In a culture where writing is sacred and deliberate, Emphasis itself is a statement. City matters here. Each Sumerian city was bound to its patron deity, and scribes did not write in isolation. They wrote within political, economic, and religious ecosystems that shaped what could be said and how it could be said. As cities grew more powerful or declined, their gods rose or faded accordingly in the textual record. What begins as theology becomes reflection of real-world instability. But this explanation only goes so far. Political rivalry alone cannot account for the deeper inconsistencies that begin to appear. Some texts describe events that other texts seem unaware of. Others preserve outcomes without causes. The same divine act is framed as benevolent in one tradition and destructive in another. These are not simple variations of myth. They are incompatible memories. One of the clearest indicators of fracture is the changing role of the divine council. In early compositions, the assembly of gods appears as a stabilizing force. Decisions are formalized there, not debated emotionally. The council represents inevitability rather than deliberation. But later texts portray the assembly differently. Disagreement becomes visible. Decisions feel reactionary. Authority feels strained rather than assured. In some accounts, the council acts collectively. In others, it appears fragmented, with powerful gods acting independently or circumventing one another. The flood narrative preserves multiple versions of the same event, each revealing a different configuration of divine agreement and dissent. The fact that these versions coexist in the tradition, rather than being corrected or unified, tells us something crucial. There was no longer a single authoritative account that could overwrite the others. This is not how stable systems behave. When authority is secure, contradictions are resolved. When authority is fractured, contradictions are preserved. The tablets begin to show signs of this preservation. Instead of harmonizing differences, scribes copy older texts alongside newer ones. They do not erase inconvenient traditions, they accumulate them. This suggests that no single interpretation holds enough power to dominate the others completely. The gods themselves begin to reflect this fragmentation. Their personalities grow sharper, more defined, more rigid. Enlil becomes increasingly associated with enforcement and punishment. Enki becomes increasingly associated with subversion and repair. In earlier texts, these traits coexist comfortably. In later ones, they stand in opposition. This opposition is never labelled as conflict outright, but its consequences are everywhere. Decrees produce unintended outcomes. Corrective actions create new problems. The same divine figure is praised for wisdom in one context and blamed for disaster in another. The gods no longer appear as parts of a seamless whole. They appear as agents navigating a system that no longer responds predictably. Language itself reflects this change. Early tablets use terms associated with balance, fittingness, and proper placement. Later ones favour words related to fate, decree, binding, and judgment. This shift is not merely stylistic. It indicates a world-view moving from harmony toward control. The first fracture is also visible in how humanity is described. In earlier compositions, humans are integrated into the cosmic order as functional participants. Their labour has purpose, their rituals have effect, their relationship with the gods feels reciprocal. Later texts describe humanity as a problem to be managed. Noise becomes a threat. Population becomes a liability. Human agency shrinks as divine impatience grows. This change does not happen all at once. It unfolds unevenly across genres. Hymns preserve older optimism longer than myths do. Legal texts codify divine authority even as narrative texts hint at its instability. The tradition does not collapse into chaos. It becomes layered. Layering is the key. The Sumerian corpus does not replace earlier beliefs. It builds on top of them, even when the foundation no longer fits. This creates tension that the text never resolve. Instead, they live with it. Some of the most revealing evidence of fracture lies in genealogies. Divine lineages shift subtly over time. Relationships are redefined. A god once described as subordinate appears later as autonomous. Another fades into obscurity without explanation. These changes suggest renegotiation of authority after the fact. Genealogy in mythological systems is never just family history, it is political structure. Who descends from whom determines who holds legitimacy. When genealogies shift, it reflects a struggle over authority that cannot be addressed directly. The Anunnaki begin to take clearer shape in this context. Their emergence coincides not with unity, but with confusion. They appear as a group whose authority is collective rather than individual. This is significant. When individual gods can no longer command unquestioned loyalty, authority becomes distributed. Judgment replaces governance. The Anunnaki do not resolve contradiction, they manage its consequences. Their association with fate and the underworld places them outside daily governance. They do not interfere in disputes, they finalize outcomes. This role makes sense only in a world where disputes have become unavoidable. Another sign of fracture appears in how disasters are explained. Earlier texts treat catastrophe as imbalance corrected. Later ones treat it as punishment imposed. This shift implies a loss of confidence in natural causation. When systems fail repeatedly, blame replaces explanation. Floods, droughts, plagues, and invasions begin to appear not as environmental events, but as divine responses to human excess. This moralization of disaster reflects anxiety within the tradition. When cause and effect no longer align clearly, meaning must be imposed. The scribes recording these events are not neutral observers. They are participants in a culture struggling to reconcile inherited beliefs with lived reality. Their tablets preserve that struggle. What makes this first fracture so important is not that disagreement exists, but that it is no longer resolved. The tradition stops correcting itself. It starts remembering multiple versions of truth simultaneously. This is not confusion, it is accommodation. The Sumerians choose preservation over coherence. They accept that the past cannot be reduced to a single story. This acceptance allows contradiction to survive. In a stable divine order, contradiction would signal error. In a fractured one, contradiction becomes evidence. The tablets do not announce this shift. They do not frame it as loss or failure. They simply record what can no longer be unified. Authority continues, but it does so unevenly. Power remains, but consensus fades. This is the moment when conflict moves from latent to structural. Not because the gods fight openly, but because their world no longer speaks with one voice. Each text becomes a fragment of a larger unresolved memory. As the narrative moves forward, this fracture will widen. The inconsistencies preserved here will harden into divisions. Roles will become defensive. Authority will rely increasingly on enforcement rather than alignment. The Anunnaki will step more fully into their function, as arbiters of fate rather than participants in governance. For now, the break is quiet. It exists between lines, between tablets, between cities. It is visible only when traditions are compared, when agreement can no longer be assumed. The gods still rule, the cosmos still functions, but something essential has been lost. The tablets no longer agree because the world they describe no longer holds together in the way it once did. And once that coherence is gone, it cannot be restored simply by decree. By the time the Sumerian tablets begin to diverge in tone and emphasis, two figures stand at the centre of nearly every unresolved tension. Enlil and Enki are not rivals in the sense of competing for the same throne, nor are they enemies driven by personal hatred. Their conflict is quieter and far more difficult to resolve. It is a conflict over control itself, over what it means to govern a world that no longer behaves as expected. Enlil represents authority in its most uncompromising form. He is not the creator of heaven and earth, but he is the one who enforces the separation that makes order possible. The air, The storms, the breath of life and the inhabited world beneath the sky fall under his jurisdiction. His power is not subtle, it moves directly. When Enlil acts, consequences follow immediately. Winds rise, floods come, decrees are issued and reality rearranges itself to obey them. Enki operates in a different register entirely. He governs the hidden mechanisms that keep the world functioning beneath the surface. Fresh water, fertility, craft, intelligence, adaptation, and survival belong to him. Where Enlil commands, Enki adjusts. Where Enlil imposes structure, Enki finds ways around it. This difference is not incidental. It reflects two fundamentally incompatible approaches to control. The problem is not that one is right and the other is wrong. The problem is that the world requires both approaches at once, and the divine system was never designed to reconcile them fully. In the earliest texts, Enlil's authority appears necessary and effective. The newly ordered cosmos needs enforcement. Without firm boundaries, creation would collapse back into undifferentiated chaos. Enlil's rigidity ensures stability. His decrees are not arbitrary. They follow from his role as the guarantor of separation, of limits, of form. At the same time, Enki's presence ensures that rigidity does not become fatal. Life requires flexibility. Water must flow. Knowledge must adapt. When circumstances change, someone must respond creatively rather than forcefully. Enki fulfills this function. He does not contradict the system openly. He compensates for its shortcomings. As long as the world remains relatively simple, this arrangement holds. Enlil sets the rules. Enki ensures survival within them. Authority and ingenuity coexist without overt conflict. The problem of control emerges when complexity increases. Humanity grows. Cities expand. Labour intensifies. Noise fills the world. The consequences of divine decisions multiply beyond what the original structure anticipated. Enlil's approach responds to this escalation by tightening control. Rules are enforced more strictly. Punishments become broader. Silence becomes preferable to disorder. Enki responds differently. He sees that enforcement alone cannot resolve systemic strain. He looks for adjustments that preserve life without challenging authority directly. His solutions are clever, indirect, and often technically compliant with divine law while undermining its intent. This difference in response creates a growing gap between authority and outcome. Enlil believes control must be absolute to be effective. Enki understands that absolute control produces unintended consequences that must be managed. Neither position is entirely sustainable. The flood narrative reveals this problem with exceptional clarity. Enlil does not decide to destroy humanity out of malice. He does so because human activity has exceeded tolerable limits. The noise is constant. The world has become unmanageable. From Enlil's perspective, this is a failure of containment. The solution is removal. Enki does not dispute the problem. He disputes the solution. He recognizes that annihilating humanity will restore silence temporarily but destabilize the system permanently. The labor issue will return. The balance between gods and world will collapse. But Enki cannot revoke Enlil's decree. Divine law does not permit reversal. This is the core of the control problem. Authority is irreversible, even when it is flawed. Enki's response is not rebellion. He does not confront Enlil. He does not challenge his legitimacy. He works around the decree, exploiting technicalities in divine law to preserve life without violating authority overtly. He warns Zeus Sudra indirectly. He saves a remnant. He ensures continuity while maintaining the appearance of obedience. This pattern appears repeatedly in the texts. Enlil acts decisively. Enki mitigates damage. Over time, this dynamic becomes institutionalized. Authority continues to issue commands that shape the world. Adaptation continues to soften their impact quietly. The result is not balance, it is tension without resolution. Enlil cannot abandon control without undermining his role. Enki cannot stop intervening without allowing collapse. Each god's function reinforces the other's limitations. The system depends on both, but it cannot reconcile them. This tension is not limited to catastrophic events. It appears in law, in fate, in daily life. Enlil's influence is visible in the rigid structure of kingship, in the idea that authority descends from heaven and must be obeyed without question. Enki's influence appears in craftsmanship, medicine, magic, and ingenuity, in all the ways humans adapt to constraints imposed from above. The gods themselves mirror this division. Enlil is distant, increasingly associated with punishment and enforcement. Enki is present, engaged, involved in human survival. Over time, this difference hardens into something resembling opposition, even though the texts never frame it that way explicitly. The problem is that control cannot remain centralized when reality becomes decentralized. Human societies diversify. Cities develop distinct identities. Economic systems grow complex. Environmental conditions fluctuate. A single, inflexible authority cannot respond effectively to all of this without causing harm. Enlil's decrees reflect a desire for uniformity. Enki's interventions reflect acceptance of variability. These approaches collide not because the gods disagree emotionally, but because their functions demand incompatible responses. This incompatibility becomes more pronounced as divine decisions begin to affect not just God's nature, but human fate directly. Lifespans shorten. Death becomes regulated. Suffering is normalized. The underworld is formalized. Here, the Anunnaki begin to matter more. The rise of the Anunnaki as judges of fate is not a coincidence. It represents an attempt to resolve the control problem by shifting responsibility away from visible authority. Instead of Enlil directly imposing consequences, fate itself becomes structured, administered, and finalized by a collective. This does not restore harmony. It creates distance. Enlil retains authority. Enki retains adaptability. But the consequences of their conflict are now mediated through an impersonal system. Judgment replaces negotiation. Fate replaces flexibility. Humanity experiences this shift as loss. The world becomes harsher, less forgiving. Divine interaction becomes ritualized rather than relational. Appeals are no longer effective. Outcomes feel predetermined. From the divine perspective, this arrangement reduces strain. Enlil no longer needs to respond to every disruption. Enki no longer needs to intervene constantly. The Anunnaki absorb the burden of finality. But this solution introduces a new instability. By removing responsibility from active governance, the gods detach themselves from consequence. Suffering becomes abstract. Control becomes procedural. The problem of control is not solved, it is displaced. The tablets preserve this displacement without commentary. They do not judge Enlil or Enki. They do not frame one as villain and the other as hero. They document a system grappling with its own limitations. What emerges is a world governed by layered authority. Commands originate above. Adjustments occur below. Final outcomes are handled elsewhere. No single god fully controls the system anymore. This fragmentation is subtle but profound. Authority still exists, but it is no longer cohesive. Control persists, but it is distributed across incompatible functions. The civil war, as later traditions might call it, is not fought with weapons. It is fought through jurisdiction, through decree and workaround, through law and loophole. Enlil and Enki do not destroy each other. They continue to coexist, but their coexistence becomes strained, mediated, and increasingly indirect. The harmony assumed at creation gives way to management. The Sumerian texts do not offer resolution because none existed. The gods continue to rule a world that has outgrown its original structure. Control remains necessary, but peace becomes conditional. As the narrative moves forward, this unresolved tension will manifest in more explicit divisions. Councils will fail to maintain unity. Authority will fracture further. The Anunnaki will solidify their role as arbiters rather than participants. For now, the problem of control remains suspended between enforcement and adaptation. Enlil and Enki continue to shape the world not as enemies, but as incompatible necessities. The conflict is not declared, it is embedded. And in that embedded conflict, the foundations of divine authority continue to shift, slowly and irreversibly. There was a time when the divine council existed not as a place of dispute, but as a mechanism for preserving inevitability. In the earlier Sumerian understanding, the assembly of the gods was not a parliament of competing voices. It was an institution that confirmed what could not be avoided. Decisions were not debated into existence. They emerged from necessity and were formalized through decree. The council did not create order, it acknowledged it. As long as the cosmos behaved within expected limits, this system functioned. The council's authority rested on shared assumptions about how the world worked and what outcomes were required to keep it stable. But as pressures accumulated and contradictions deepened, those shared assumptions began to erode. The council did not collapse all at once, it failed incrementally, through decisions that solved immediate problems while quietly dividing those responsible for making them. The earliest signs of this failure appear not in overt disagreement, but in the changing nature of decrees themselves. Early decisions are precise, limited in scope, and clearly connected to observable imbalance. Later decrees grow broader, more absolute, and less tied to specific causes. The language shifts from correction to enforcement. Where once the council responded to disruption, it now attempts to prevent it preemptively. This shift creates tension among the gods because it changes the function of authority. A decree that responds to imbalance invites cooperation. A decree that anticipates disobedience assumes resistance. Once authority begins to assume resistance, it inevitably produces it. The divine assembly was never composed of equals. Power was stratified, with senior gods setting the terms and lesser gods bearing the consequences. But earlier texts imply that even unequal authority could operate smoothly if its purpose was understood and accepted. What destabilized the council was not hierarchy itself, but the growing gap between decision and consequence. As humanity expanded and the world grew louder and more complex, the council faced problems it had never been designed to handle. Population growth, environmental strain, and human unpredictability introduced variables that could not be controlled through simple decree. Each decision now carried secondary effects that rippled beyond its intended scope. When councils fail, they rarely fail because members disagree openly. They fail because agreement becomes meaningless. Decisions continue to be issued, but they no longer reflect a shared understanding of reality. The Sumerian texts preserve exactly this condition. Decrees are made, but their outcomes surprise even the gods who issue them. The flood decision exemplifies this failure, but it is not the first instance. Earlier compositions describe moments when divine decisions produce suffering that seems disproportionate to the offence. Cities are destroyed, entire populations vanish. The texts do not frame these events as moral judgments. They frame them as consequences of authority exercised without adequate foresight. This is where division enters the council, not as factional rebellion, but as divergence of response. Some gods accept harsh outcomes as necessary. Others view them as evidence that the system itself is flawed. These perspectives cannot be reconciled within a framework that forbids reversal of decree. Once spoken, divine law cannot be withdrawn. This principle is foundational, but it becomes dangerous when applied to complex systems. It removes the possibility of correction. When a decision produces harm, the only permitted response is mitigation, not amendment. This structural limitation forces the council into an untenable position. Either it continues issuing decrees that may cause further harm, or it refrains from action and allows disorder to spread. Neither option preserves unity. As a result, authority begins to fragment functionally even if it remains unified in name. Some gods withdraw from decision-making entirely, others dominate proceedings more forcefully. Silence becomes as significant as speech. Absence becomes a form of dissent. The tablets reflect this fragmentation subtly. Some texts omit the council altogether, presenting divine action as unilateral. Others emphasize collective decision-making while glossing over disagreement. Still others preserve multiple versions of the same event, each implying a different configuration of agreement and resistance. The coexistence of these versions is itself evidence of failure. In a stable system, contradictions are resolved. In an unstable one, they are archived. The divine assembly's inability to resolve disagreement openly leads to a shift in how responsibility is assigned. Rather than addressing causes, the council increasingly focuses on outcomes. Fate becomes fixed. Consequence replaces dialogue. This is the moment when the Anunnaki's role begins to expand. As judges and determiners of fate, they absorb responsibility for outcomes that no longer feel attributable to any single decision-maker. By assigning finality to a collective, the council avoids internal confrontation. But this avoidance comes at a cost. When responsibility is diffused, accountability disappears. Decisions are still made, but no one fully owns their consequences. Suffering becomes an accepted byproduct rather than a problem to be solved. The council does not dissolve. It continues to exist, but its function changes. It becomes less a place of alignment and more a formal body that ratifies outcomes already set in motion. Authority persists, but consensus does not. This transformation is visible in the way later texts treat divine law. Earlier compositions emphasize alignment between divine will and cosmic necessity. Later ones emphasize obedience. Law becomes something imposed rather than something that emerges naturally from order. The gods themselves reflect this shift. They appear less confident, more reactive. Punishments escalate. Interventions become more drastic. The margin for tolerance shrinks. The failure of councils is not dramatic. There are no recorded walkouts or open rebellions. Instead, there is disengagement. Gods act independently. Decisions are implemented without full participation. The appearance of unity masks functional division. This division deepens over time. As the Anunnaki take on greater responsibility for fate, the council's role diminishes further. Governance moves away from collective deliberation toward bureaucratic finality. From the human perspective, this shift manifests as inevitability. Events feel predetermined. Appeals seem futile. Ritual replaces dialogue. Offerings become maintenance payments rather than meaningful exchanges. The Sumerians did not interpret this as divine cruelty. They interpreted it as the cost of complexity. A world that has grown too intricate to be governed through shared understanding must be governed through rules. But rules without consensus create distance. The gods become less accessible. Their decisions become harder to predict. The relationship between divine and human shifts from partnership to submission. The council's failure also reshapes the memory of earlier harmony. What was once assumed becomes idealized. Later texts look back on the time before rigid enforcement as a lost coherence, even if it was never perfect. This nostalgia does not lead to reform. The system cannot return to its earlier state because the conditions that supported it no longer exist. Population, knowledge, and ambition have grown beyond what the original structure could sustain. As a result, authority adapts by narrowing rather than expanding. Decisions become simpler, harsher, and more absolute. The council's role becomes ceremonial rather than corrective. The Anunnaki's prominence in later texts reflects this transition. They represent the final layer of governance in a system that no longer trusts itself to negotiate. Judgment replaces discussion. Fate replaces deliberation. The divine assembly continues to exist, but it no longer resolves tension. It manages it. The cost of this management is borne by humanity. and by the gods who must live within the consequences of decisions they can no longer change. This is the deeper meaning of council failure in the Sumerian tradition. It is not the collapse of authority, but the loss of shared understanding that once made authority effective. Decisions still divide reality, but they no longer unite those who make them. As the narrative moves forward, the effects of this failure will become more visible. Divine roles will harden. Authority will fragment further. The Anunnaki will step fully into their role as arbiters of an order that no longer rests on consensus. For now, the councils still meet. Decrees are still issued. The cosmos continues to function. But beneath that continuity lies a growing divide, one that no assembly can close, because the system itself has lost the flexibility required to heal. The decisions that once preserved order now expose its limits. And with each unresolved decree, the distance between authority and peace grows wider, shaping a world governed not by harmony, but by control that can no longer pretend to be unified. When the Sumerian texts speak of conflict among the gods, they do so without the language of armies, weapons, or organized violence. There are no ranks of divine soldiers marching across the sky, no battlefields littered with fallen deities, no heroic confrontations resolved through force of arms. This absence is deliberate. It reflects a fundamentally different understanding of what conflict meant at a cosmic level. For the Sumerians, divine struggle was not something that could be fought physically. It was something that unfolded through authority, consequence, and imbalance. The gods did not need armies because their power did not operate through confrontation. It operated through control of systems. When a god acted, the result was not a clash with another god's strength, but a shift in how reality itself behaved. Storms replaced dialogue. Drought followed disagreement. Silence descended where life had once flourished. These were not metaphors for battle. They were the battles themselves. In this worldview, conflict was expressed through outcomes rather than actions. One god did not strike another. One god issued a decree, and the effects of that decree rippled outward, colliding with the domain of another god. The friction occurred not at the level of intent, but at the level of consequence. When domains overlapped or decisions interfered with one another, the result was disruption in the human world. The Sumerians understood that gods could not fight openly without threatening the structure of existence. To imagine gods engaging in physical warfare would be to imagine the laws of nature collapsing under competing forces. Instead, conflict had to be contained within the system itself. It manifested as imbalance rather than destruction. This is why divine conflict is so often described through environmental change. Floods, storms, failed harvests, plagues, and sudden reversals of fortune are not random disasters. They are signals that divine forces are no longer aligned. When rain comes at the wrong time, when rivers overflow or dry up unexpectedly, when cities fall without warning, the cause is not chance. It is unresolved tension among the powers that govern those forces. The language used to describe these events is telling. Texts speak of gods becoming restless, disturbed, or unable to sleep. Noise rises. The world becomes unbearable. These descriptions frame conflict as irritation rather than hatred, as strain rather than aggression. The gods are not depicted as seeking to destroy one another. They are depicted as losing tolerance for the consequences of coexistence. One god's attempt to restore order becomes another god's disruption. When Enlil sends a storm to silence humanity, he is not attacking Enki. He is enforcing his mandate. But that enforcement undermines Enki's efforts to sustain life. The clash occurs in the outcome, not the intention. This indirectness defines Sumerian depictions of divine struggle. The gods do not confront each other because confrontation would require acknowledgement of equal standing. Instead, they act within their own authority, knowing that their actions will inevitably affect others. Conflict emerges from overlapping jurisdiction rather than direct opposition. The underworld provides another example of this pattern. When fate is fixed, When death becomes unavoidable, when judgment becomes final, these are not acts of violence against life. They are administrative decisions that alter the conditions under which life exists. The Anunnaki do not kill, they decree. Their power lies in finality. This form of conflict is quieter than war, but far more pervasive. It does not end when a battle is over. It reshapes reality permanently. Once a decree is spoken, the world must adapt to it. If that adaptation causes suffering, the suffering is not reversed. It is absorbed. The Sumerian texts reflect this understanding consistently. They do not dwell on spectacle. They focus on process. A god speaks, the world responds, another god reacts indirectly. The system strains. This is why divine conflict often appears unresolved. There is no decisive victory because there is no battlefield where victory could be achieved. Each action alters the balance, but no action restores harmony completely. Humanity experiences this form of conflict as instability. Crops fail despite proper rituals. Cities fall despite faithful worship. Kings lose favour without clear cause. These outcomes are not interpreted as divine abandonment. They are interpreted as evidence that divine forces are no longer aligned. The absence of armies also reflects the Sumerian belief that gods are not bound by physical limitation. They do not need tools to exert power. Their will is embedded in the structure of existence itself. When they disagree, existence itself becomes the arena of conflict. This belief shapes how stories are told. Instead of describing confrontations, texts describe consequences. Instead of narrating battles, they record changes. Instead of celebrating victory, they explain survival. Even myths that later cultures reinterpret as wars appear very differently in Sumerian sources. Stories of storms battling monsters, or gods subduing chaos, are less about combat and more about containment. Chaos is not an enemy to be destroyed. It is a force to be restrained. When restraint fails, disorder returns. This framing is essential to understanding what later readers misinterpret as civil war. The Sumerians were not describing gods turning against one another violently. They were describing a system in which authority no longer functioned smoothly, where decisions collided and consequences accumulated. The language of struggle appears in metaphors of binding, fixing, decreeing, and limiting. Fate is tied. Words are fastened. Life is shortened. Access is restricted. These are not acts of war. They are acts of control responding to perceived threat. The threat, notably, is not another god. It is excess. Too much noise, too much growth, too much unpredictability. The world itself becomes difficult to govern. Divine conflict arises not from ambition, but from overload. This perspective explains why the Anunnaki are associated with judgment rather than conquest. They do not expand territory, they regulate outcomes. Their authority is not exercised through force, but through final decisions that cannot be appealed. In this system, conflict is never resolved through victory. It is resolved through limitation. Something must be reduced. Humanity's numbers, lifespans, freedom, access to divine presence. Each limitation represents a compromise imposed to preserve stability. The gods do not celebrate these outcomes, they accept them. The tone of the texts is often resigned rather than triumphant. The world continues, but it does so under constraint. This resignation is one of the most striking features of Sumerian theology. There is no promise of eventual reconciliation among divine forces. There is no expectation that harmony will be restored fully. Conflict is treated as a permanent condition that must be managed. The absence of armies reinforces this permanence. Wars, in human terms, end. Battles conclude. Peace treaties are signed. But the Sumerian conception of divine conflict offers no such closure. Once imbalance enters the system, it cannot be undone. It can only be redirected. This redirection often takes the form of distance. The gods withdraw from direct involvement. Interaction becomes ritualized. communication becomes symbolic. The human-divine relationship grows more formal, more regulated, less intimate. From the human perspective, this feels like loss. Earlier texts describe gods walking among humans, speaking directly, intervening personally. Later texts describe gods who must be approached through layers of ritual and law. This shift reflects the cumulative effect of unresolved conflict. Battles without armies leave no visible scars, but their impact is deeper. They alter expectations. They reshape relationships. They redefine what is possible. The Sumerians did not dramatize this process because it was not dramatic to them. It was explanatory. They were less interested in how conflict looked than in what it produced. When modern readers search these texts for wars, they miss the point. The Sumerians were not hiding stories of combat. They were documenting the failure of governance, the breakdown of consensus, the limits of authority. Divine conflict, as they understood it, did not require weapons. It required incompatible decisions made irreversible. It required a world complex enough to exceed the system designed to govern it. As the narrative moves forward, the effects of these battles without armies will become more pronounced. The Anunnaki will assume greater responsibility. Fate will harden further. Humanity's role will narrow. The absence of overt war does not mean peace. It means that conflict has become structural, embedded into the functioning of the cosmos itself. And once conflict reaches that level, it no longer needs armies to persist. It lives on in law, in fate, in silence, and in the quiet understanding that the gods themselves are no longer fully aligned. The Anunnaki do not emerge in the Sumerian texts as conquerors stepping onto an already stable stage. They take shape slowly, almost reluctantly, during a period when the existing structure of divine authority is no longer sufficient to manage the consequences it has created. Their appearance is not announced. There is no moment where a tablet declares their arrival as something new. Instead, they crystallize out of necessity, filling a role that did not previously exist in such a defined form. In the earliest layers of Sumerian cosmology, the gods operate within a relatively simple hierarchy. Authority flows downward. Responsibility is distributed according to domain. When imbalance occurs, it is corrected through direct intervention. But as pressures accumulate and decisions begin to collide with one another, the system requires something different. It requires finality. This is where the Anunnaki begin to matter. They are not introduced as a single god, or even as a clearly defined group at first. Their name appears in lists, in passing references, in contexts that assume familiarity rather than explanation. This suggests that by the time scribes are writing these texts, the Anunnaki are already understood as part of the cosmic framework. What changes is not their existence, but their function. Originally, divine authority relied on active governance. Gods acted. They intervened. They corrected. But active governance becomes increasingly costly in a complex world. Each intervention produces secondary effects. Each correction creates new imbalance elsewhere. Over time, this makes direct action less desirable. Authority begins to retreat from immediacy, and instead establishes mechanisms that operate without constant divine involvement. The Anunnaki embody this shift. They are associated with fate, judgment, and the underworld, not because these concepts were absent before, but because they needed to be formalized. Death had always existed. Fate had always been spoken. But during the crisis of governance, these elements are organized into a system. The Anunnaki become its administrators. This transformation is subtle, but profound. Earlier texts describe gods making decisions that shape the world dynamically. Later texts describe outcomes that feel fixed. The difference lies not in what happens, but in how it happens. Where once a god might intervene to save or destroy, now fate itself carries out the decision. The Anunnaki are the interface between decision and outcome. Their collective nature is significant. Authority that once resided in individual gods now disperses across a group. This diffusion reduces conflict among senior gods by removing the need for any one of them to bear full responsibility for final outcomes. Judgment becomes impersonal. Fate becomes collective. In Sumerian thought, this is not an abdication of power. It is a containment strategy. The underworld, ruled and regulated by the Anunnaki, becomes the space where unresolved consequences are deposited. Life above continues. Order is maintained. But what cannot be reconciled is sent below, governed by rules that do not require constant revision. This arrangement allows the cosmos to function despite internal disagreement. Enlil can continue to issue decrees. Enki can continue to adapt around them. The Anunnaki ensure that outcomes remain consistent regardless of intervention. Their role as judges of the dead reinforces this function. Death is the one condition that applies equally to all. By placing authority over death in the hands of a collective, the system guarantees uniformity, where variability would otherwise create chaos. This does not make the Anunnaki benevolent or malevolent, it makes them necessary. The crisis that gives rise to their prominence is not a single event, it is a prolonged condition. The tablets reflect this through gradual emphasis. Mentions of the Anunnaki increase in context related to fate, law, and consequence. They are invoked where decisions must be enforced without appeal. This is especially visible in texts dealing with oaths, curses, and irreversible outcomes. To swear by the Anunnaki is to accept finality. To be judged by them is to face an outcome that cannot be negotiated. In this sense, the Anunnaki represent the hard edge of order. Their emergence marks a shift from governance through relationship to governance through system. Earlier divine-human interactions are personal. Gods speak directly. They respond emotionally. Later interactions are procedural. Ritual replaces conversation. Law replaces favour. This shift reflects a loss of intimacy that parallels the loss of consensus among the gods themselves. The Anunnaki are not the cause of this loss, they are its consequence. As divine authority fractures, the system compensates by creating distance. The Anunnaki occupy that distance. They operate where direct engagement is no longer viable. This explains why they are associated more strongly with the underworld than with the heavens. The heavens are the realm of intention. The underworld is the realm of result. When intentions conflict, results must still be managed. The number of Anunnaki varies across texts, but the most common grouping emphasizes 7. This number carries weight not because it denotes individuals, but because it signifies completeness. A full panel, a closed judgment, no remainder. 7 judges do not argue, they decide. This contrasts sharply with earlier divine councils, which attempted to reconcile competing interests. The Anunnaki do not reconcile, they conclude. Their authority is not creative, it is terminal. This is why later traditions misunderstand their role so easily. From the outside, judgment looks like power, finality looks like control. But within the Sumerian framework, the Anunnaki are not architects of the world. They are its custodians after damage has already occurred. They preside over a universe that has lost the flexibility it once possessed. Humanity feels their presence most acutely. Where earlier gods could be petitioned, appeased, or persuaded, the Anunnaki cannot. Once fate is fixed, it holds. This creates a new kind of anxiety. Ritual becomes precise. Transgression becomes dangerous. The margin for error narrows. Yet even this rigidity serves a purpose. It stabilizes expectations. In a world where divine authority no longer speaks with one voice, consistency becomes more valuable than mercy. The Anunnaki provide that consistency. They do not resolve the underlying conflict among the gods, they make it survivable. By absorbing responsibility for irreversible outcomes, they allow the senior gods to continue governing without confronting their own disagreements directly. This preserves the appearance of unity while accommodating division. The tablets never describe this process explicitly. They do not say the Anunnaki were created to solve a crisis. They simply show them becoming more prominent as the crisis deepens. This is how institutional change appears in mythological records, not as reform, but as normalization. Over time, the Anunnaki's role becomes so embedded that later texts treat it as eternal. Fate has always been fixed, judgment has always existed, but the earlier layers tell a different story. They show a world where outcomes were negotiable, where divine action was immediate, where consequences could still be redirected. The Anunnaki mark the end of that world. They stand at the boundary between an earlier, more fluid cosmos and a later, more constrained one. Their rise does not signal victory in a divine war. It signals accommodation after prolonged strain. As the narrative continues, their influence will extend further into law, kingship, and human destiny. What begins here as a response to divine crisis will shape every layer of existence below. The gods will continue to rule. Humanity will continue to serve. The cosmos will continue to function. But the terms of that functioning have changed. The Anunnaki take shape not as heroes or villains, but as the form that authority assumes when peace is no longer guaranteed. As the strain within divine authority deepens, the structure of the cosmos itself begins to reflect division. Heaven, earth, and the underworld do not split through proclamation or open defiance. They separate through alignment. Each realm begins to embody a different response to the same unresolved crisis, and in doing so, they take on distinct roles that no longer function as parts of a single, fluid system. This is not a moment where the universe fractures physically. The Sumerian texts never describe the sky breaking away from the land or the underworld rising in rebellion. What changes instead is orientation. Each realm becomes associated with a particular philosophy of control, a particular way of responding to disorder, and a particular set of divine actors who enforce that response. Heaven remains the source of legitimacy, and does not descend into conflict. He does not issue frequent decrees. His authority is distant, abstract, and increasingly symbolic. Heaven represents the idea that order exists, that structure has a foundation, even if that structure no longer functions smoothly. In this sense, heaven chooses preservation over intervention. It maintains continuity of authority without engaging directly in its failures. Earth becomes the realm where conflict is felt most acutely. This is where human activity unfolds, where population grows, where noise accumulates, where the consequences of divine decisions become unavoidable. Enlil's authority dominates here, not because it is uncontested, but because enforcement must occur somewhere. Earth becomes the space where order is imposed rather than negotiated. Storms, droughts, and destruction are not acts of cruelty in this framework. They are expressions of enforcement when harmony has failed. Earth aligns with rigidity because rigidity is the only remaining tool that appears capable of maintaining structure amid chaos. The underworld takes on a different role entirely. It becomes the realm of conclusion rather than control. Governed by the Anunnaki, it does not intervene in ongoing affairs. It does not attempt correction. It accepts outcomes and fixes them permanently. In doing so, it removes unresolved tension from the upper world. This triadic division represents a functional split. Heaven legitimizes, earth enforces, the underworld finalizes. None of these realms declares allegiance explicitly. Their alignment is revealed through action and responsibility. Decisions made in heaven are enacted on earth and finalized below. The flow of authority becomes vertical rather than collaborative. This shift is visible in how texts describe divine movement. Earlier myths allowed gods to travel freely between realms. They visit cities. They speak directly to humans. They intervene personally. Later texts restrict movement. Gods remain within their domains. Interaction becomes formalized. This restriction is not arbitrary. It reflects a need to prevent further instability. When authority is contested, distance reduces friction. The realms choose separation not out of hostility, but out of necessity. Heaven's withdrawal signals loss of direct oversight. Earth's rigidity signals loss of flexibility. The underworld's prominence signals loss of reversibility. Together, these changes mark a universe adapting to sustained internal conflict. Humanity experiences this adaptation as stratification of power. Appeals no longer reach heaven easily. Earth responds with punishment rather than guidance. The underworld offers no appeal at all. This is where the idea of sides becomes meaningful. Not sides in a war, but orientations toward outcome. Heaven favours continuity of authority. Earth favours enforcement of order. The underworld favours finality. These orientations do not align naturally. They coexist because they must, but they pull in different directions. Heaven's distance frustrates those seeking explanation. Earth's severity breeds resentment. The underworld's silence breeds fear. The gods associated with each realm reflect these tensions. An becomes increasingly remote. Enlil becomes increasingly severe. The Anunnaki become increasingly central to fate. Enki, whose domain overlaps boundaries, finds himself constrained. His ability to move between realms diminishes as boundaries harden. This marginalization of boundary-crossing power is significant. Enki's strength lay in adaptation, in fluidity, in mediation. As realms choose sides, mediation becomes suspect. Flexibility is reinterpreted as risk. The texts do not condemn this shift. They present it as the natural evolution of a system under pressure. When consensus fails, separation becomes the only way to prevent collapse. Cities reflect this cosmology. Temples emphasize different aspects of divine authority, depending on their patron deity. Legal codes stress enforcement. Funerary practices emphasize judgment and fate. Rituals become more precise, less conversational. The world grows quieter in one sense and harsher in another. Noise is suppressed. Spontaneity disappears. Order persists, but it is no longer shared. The division of realms also redefines divine responsibility. Heaven is no longer blamed for daily suffering. Earth enforces without apology. The underworld absorbs consequence. Responsibility becomes compartmentalized. This compartmentalization allows the system to endure despite unresolved conflict. Each realm can function without confronting the full scope of the crisis. Heaven maintains legitimacy. Earth maintains control. The underworld maintains closure. But this endurance comes at a cost. The unity of the cosmos is replaced by coordination without harmony. The gods no longer act as a collective consciousness. They act as administrators of separate domains. Human memory preserves this change through myth rather than doctrine. Stories emphasize descent rather than ascent. Journeys to the underworld replace visits from heaven. Fate replaces favor. The Anunnaki's authority grows precisely because the underworld becomes essential. When outcomes cannot be renegotiated above, they must be settled below. Judgment becomes the final expression of divine will. This does not mean that heaven and earth are powerless. It means that their power is incomplete without finality. Together, the three realms form a closed system. No realm can override the others without destabilizing the whole. In choosing sides, the realms choose survival over unity. They accept division as preferable to collapse. The cosmos becomes layered, regulated, and constrained. This layered order defines the world that humanity inherits. A world where authority is distant, enforcement is immediate, and fate is final. A world shaped not by a single divine will, but by a compromise forged under pressure. As the narrative continues, this division will shape law, kingship, and memory. The gods will still be present, but their presence will be filtered through realm and role. The civil war, such as it was, leaves no battlefield, it leaves structure, and that structure, once established, becomes the quiet framework within which all future stories unfold. Once the divine order fractures into alignment rather than unity, conflict no longer expresses itself through negotiation or compromise. it expresses itself through consequence. The Sumerian tablets begin to record a pattern that grows steadily more pronounced as the crisis deepens. Punishment replaces persuasion, banishment replaces reconciliation, and defeat occurs without ceremony or acknowledgement. These are not dramatic events, they are administrative outcomes. Punishment in the Sumerian worldview is never framed primarily as moral correction. It is functional. When something disrupts order, it must be removed, limited, or redirected. Early texts describe correction as proportional and restorative. Later ones describe it as absolute. This shift is one of the clearest indicators that divine authority has lost confidence in its ability to maintain balance through cooperation. Punishments become broader and less specific. Entire cities are destroyed for offences that earlier generations might have addressed through ritual or appeasement. Crops fail without clear explanation. Plagues appear as facts rather than warnings. The texts do not dwell on outrage or injustice. They present these outcomes as inevitable responses to instability. This inevitability is the key change. Earlier traditions emphasize that divine displeasure can be remedied. Offerings can restore favour. Proper ritual can correct imbalance. But as the divine system hardens, remediation gives way to enforcement. Once punishment is imposed, it stands. Banishment emerges as a particularly telling mechanism. Gods do not merely punish, they remove. A deity loses influence. A city loses its patron. A lineage fades from prominence. These removals are rarely explained. They are recorded as accomplished facts. A god who is banished is not described as defeated in battle. Their name simply stops appearing. Their temples fall into disuse. Their attributes are absorbed by others. This silence is not accidental. It reflects a culture unwilling to depict divine power as fallible through confrontation. Defeat becomes something that happens quietly. The same pattern applies to humans. Kings disappear from lists. Dynasties end abruptly. Floods erase generations. The texts record outcomes, not struggles. Survival is what matters. The reason becomes secondary. The underworld's growing prominence reinforces this pattern. Judgment there is final and unappealable. Once fate is decreed, it cannot be negotiated. This removes the need for repeated intervention above. Punishment becomes permanent by default. The Anunnaki preside over this system. Their role as judges ensures that outcomes are consistent even if they are harsh. They do not explain their decisions, they enact them. This lack of explanation is itself a form of control. When reasons are absent, resistance becomes impossible. Without understanding cause, one cannot challenge effect. Silent defeats occur when authority shifts without acknowledgement. Enki's influence is constrained not through direct opposition, but through limitation of movement and scope. His interventions become increasingly indirect. His successes are partial. His role narrows. Enlil's authority appears to grow, but even this growth carries signs of strain. His punishments escalate because earlier measures no longer suffice. Severity replaces subtlety. This is not triumph, it is compensation. The divine council's earlier failures ensure that no single god can claim victory. Power persists, but it does so defensively. Each punishment reinforces the system while revealing its fragility. Human suffering increases under this regime, but the texts do not frame it as tragedy. They frame it as cost. Civilization is preserved, but at the price of freedom, longevity, and proximity to the divine. Banishment also functions symbolically. It removes disruptive elements without confronting them. A god who challenges order is marginalized rather than overthrown. A city that resists is erased rather than negotiated with. The record remains clean, the system remains intact. This cleanliness is deceptive. It masks unresolved conflict beneath layers of enforcement. The silence surrounding defeat is one of the most striking features of the later Sumerian corpus. There are no lamentations for fallen gods, no elegies for lost authority. Loss is normalized. This normalization shapes memory. Later generations inherit a world where certain possibilities simply no longer exist. Longevity beyond a human lifespan is gone. Direct divine instruction is rare. Negotiation has limits. These absences are not explained, they are assumed. Punishments and banishments serve to narrow the world until it fits the reduced capacity of the divine system to manage it. Complexity is trimmed, excess is removed. What remains is governable. But governable does not mean peaceful. The gods do not celebrate this outcome, they accept it. The tone of the text reflects resignation rather than victory. Order persists because it must, not because it is just. Humanity adapts to this reality through law, ritual and memory. Offerings become more precise. Transgressions become more dangerous. Fate becomes something to endure rather than influence. The civil conflict among the gods leaves no monuments. It leaves conditions, shorter lives, fixed destinies, silent underworld judgments, distance between realms. These are the marks of punishment that never ends and defeat that never announces itself. As the narrative continues, these conditions will harden further. What begins as response becomes structure. What begins as enforcement becomes tradition. The gods remain, but their world is quieter, narrower, and more controlled. And in that controlled world, the memory of conflict survives not in stories of war, but in the shape of existence itself. Humanity does not appear in the Sumerian record as the climax of creation, or as the intended centerpiece of the cosmos. Instead, humans enter the narrative after strain has already taken hold, after divine authority has begun to falter, and after the system governing heaven and earth shows clear signs of overload. This timing is not incidental. It is one of the most revealing details preserved in the tablets. The earliest texts do not describe a peaceful divine world that suddenly decides to create humans out of generosity or curiosity. They describe a world already burdened by labour, noise and imbalance. The gods exist, the cosmos functions, but the maintenance of that functioning has become unsustainable. Humanity is introduced not as an ideal, but as an intervention. This alone changes how the entire story must be read. The gods did not create humans because they wanted companions. They created humans because something had already gone wrong. The conflict among divine roles, still unnamed and unresolved, had reached a point where the existing structure could no longer support itself. Labour was excessive. Responsibility was uneven. Authority could command, but it could not endlessly perform. The tablets describe the lesser gods digging canals, piling earth, shaping the landscape that would support civilization. Their complaints are not framed as rebellion. They are framed as exhaustion. The system demands too much, and no adjustment within the existing hierarchy can resolve that demand. This is the environment into which humanity is introduced. Humanity is a solution, not a beginning. This matters because it places humans downstream from divine conflict. Humans inherit a world already shaped by unresolved tension. Their purpose is defined by that tension from the start. They are created to absorb burden, to stabilize a system that can no longer balance itself internally. This does not mean humans are created maliciously. The tone of the creation texts is pragmatic rather than cruel. The gods recognize a problem and devise a response, but the response is constrained by the same rigidity that produced the problem in the first place. Authority cannot reform itself, so it creates something beneath itself to compensate. Humans are placed between gods and world, tasked with maintaining order physically, while divine authority maintains it abstractly. This positioning exposes humanity to the consequences of divine disagreement without granting them any power to influence it. The timing of human creation also explains why humans are immediately subject to limits. Lifespan, fertility, labour, and fate are all regulated early in the human story. These are not punishments for disobedience. They are controls designed to prevent humanity from becoming another destabilizing force. The gods have already learned that unchecked growth produces noise, disruption, and strain. Humanity is created under conditions meant to avoid repeating that problem. This is why early humans in the texts are never portrayed as free. They are functional. Their labor is defined. Their rituals are prescribed. Their boundaries are clear. Freedom, in the modern sense, is not part of the design. Humanity's dual nature reflects this origin. Humans are formed from primordial clay, connecting them to the earlier substance of creation, but they are animated by divine essence, binding them to the authority that governs the cosmos. This makes them neither fully natural nor fully divine. They exist in tension, just as the gods do. This tension becomes humanity's defining condition. Because humans are created after conflict begins, they are born into a world where harmony is already compromised. They do not experience the original balance described in earlier myths. They inherit enforcement rather than cooperation, law rather than alignment. The gods' expectations of humanity reflect this inheritance. Humans are expected to perform consistently, quietly, and predictably. Noise is discouraged. Excess is dangerous. Deviations carry consequence. These expectations mirror the lessons divine authority has already learned from its own internal strain. Humanity becomes a buffer. When gods disagree, humans absorb the fallout. Floods erase them. Droughts starve them. Laws constrain them. Fate limits them. The gods continue to rule, but humans experience the cost. This is why humanity appears vulnerable from the very beginning of the record. There is no extended age of human-divine equality. Interaction is formal from the start. Humans serve, offer, obey. The gods decide. Even divine sympathy, when it appears, is constrained. Enki's interventions on behalf of humanity are indirect and limited. He preserves survival, not autonomy. He mitigates destruction, not authority. The creation of humanity does not resolve divine conflict. It postpones its consequences. By shifting labor downward, the gods stabilize their own system temporarily. But the underlying disagreement remains. Authority is still divided. Control is still imperfect. Humanity's existence does not heal this fracture. It allows it to persist without collapse. This explains why later divine decisions target humanity so readily. Floods, plagues, and shortened lifespans are not signs that humans are uniquely offensive. They are signs that humans have become the adjustable variable in a rigid system. When divine authority cannot change itself, it changes conditions below. The tablets do not present this as injustice. They present it as necessity. The gods are not cruel. They are constrained. The system they created limits their options. Humanity's role is therefore tragic without being moralized. Humans suffer not because they fail ethically, but because they exist within a system designed to offload instability onto them. This also explains why humans are rarely consulted in divine decisions. Councils meet without them. Decrees are issued without appeal. Fate is assigned without negotiation. Humanity is not part of governance. It is part of maintenance. The civil conflict among the gods does not erupt openly, but its timing shapes everything that follows. Humanity is born into enforcement, not harmony. Control, not collaboration. As the narrative continues, humanity will become increasingly central to divine concern, not because it gains power, but because it becomes the primary site where divine conflict expresses itself. The world above strains, the world below absorbs. Humanity appears after the conflict begins because humanity is part of how the conflict is managed. And once humanity exists in that role, there is no returning to the world that came before. By the time the conflict among the gods settles into structure rather than action, its consequences are no longer recorded as events. They are recorded as rules. What once unfolded through decisions and reactions now hardens into fate and law, becoming the invisible framework within which all existence must operate. The Sumerian tablets preserve this transformation carefully, not as a victory narrative, but as a record of accommodation. The war's aftermath does not end the struggle, it encodes it. Fate, in the Sumerian understanding, is not a mystical abstraction drifting beyond comprehension. It is a system. It is spoken, fixed, and enforced. Earlier texts describe fate as something that can be shaped through divine intervention. Later texts describe it as something that holds even the gods themselves. This shift is not philosophical. It is administrative. Once conflict can no longer be resolved through action, it is resolved through permanence. The fixing of fate serves a specific purpose. It prevents endless renegotiation. When authority is divided, flexibility becomes dangerous. Each adjustment risks reopening unresolved disagreements. By fixing outcomes in advance, the system removes the need for continual divine involvement. Fate becomes a buffer between intention and consequence. Law performs a similar function. Early Sumerian society understood law as an extension of divine order. Laws did not exist independently of the gods. They were expressions of cosmic structure applied to human life. As divine authority fractures, law takes on increased importance. It becomes the means by which order is preserved without requiring constant divine arbitration. This is why legal texts grow more detailed as mythological narratives grow darker. Precision replaces trust. Obligation replaces alignment. The law does not ask whether an action is appropriate. It determines whether it is permitted. The war's aftermath is visible in the way responsibility is redistributed. Earlier divine actions are personal. A god intervenes. A god reacts. Later systems rely on impersonal enforcement. Fate is administered. Law is applied. Judgment is delivered by collective authority rather than individual will. The Anunnaki are central to this transition. Their role as judges of fate places them at the intersection of myth and law. They are not lawgivers in the human sense. They are guarantors of finality. When a fate is fixed, it passes through their authority. When judgment is rendered, it carries their weight. This collective judgment removes discretion. It also removes accountability. No single god can be blamed for a harsh outcome. Fate has spoken. The law stands. Humanity experiences this change immediately. Earlier traditions allow room for negotiation through ritual. Offerings can restore balance. Proper behaviour can avert disaster. Later traditions narrow these possibilities. Ritual becomes maintenance rather than persuasion. Correct performance ensures survival. Failure invites consequence. This narrowing reflects divine caution. The gods have learned that open systems produce instability. Fate and law close the system. They define boundaries that cannot be crossed. The shortening of human lifespan is one of the clearest examples of fate absorbing conflict. Earlier kings rule for thousands of years, existing close to the divine realm. Later humans live briefly, bounded by mortality. This change is not presented as punishment for sin. It is presented as regulation. Long life produces noise, accumulation, and complexity. Short life limits disruption. Death itself becomes orderly. The underworld is organized. Judgment is standardized. The Anunnaki preside. This organization ensures that death does not destabilize the living world further. The dead go where they are assigned. Their fate is concluded. Law mirrors this finality. Legal codes emphasize restitution, punishment, and hierarchy. Kings rule by divine mandate. Subjects obey by necessity. Justice is less about equity and more about stability. A predictable injustice is preferable to unpredictable mercy. This preference is not framed cynically. It is framed pragmatically. The system has learned through conflict that uncertainty invites collapse. fate and law eliminate uncertainty at the cost of flexibility. The war's aftermath is also written into kingship itself. Kings are no longer intermediaries who negotiate between gods and people. They become enforcers of divine law. Their legitimacy derives from alignment with fate rather than personal favour. When kings fail, they are removed without explanation. Their downfall is treated as destiny fulfilled. This treatment reinforces the idea that authority no longer rests in individual relationships. It rests in systems. Kings rule as long as they embody the system. When they no longer do, fate corrects the imbalance. Human memory adapts accordingly. Stories shift focus from divine personalities to divine principles. Law, fate, order, and judgment take precedence over narrative detail. The gods become less approachable. Their will is known through outcomes rather than speech. The war does not end in reconciliation because reconciliation would require revisiting decisions already fixed. Instead, it ends in normalization. What was once extraordinary becomes expected. What was once debated becomes law. The tablets preserve this normalization without commentary. They do not lament the loss of earlier flexibility. They record the world as it now functions. This acceptance is not approval. It is survival. Humanity learns to live within these constraints. Rituals are performed precisely. Laws are obeyed carefully. Fate is respected even when it is harsh. Resistance becomes dangerous not because it is immoral, but because it is futile. The gods themselves retreat behind these systems. Their direct involvement decreases. Their authority remains absolute, but it is mediated. Law and fate stand between divine will and human experience. This mediation allows the cosmos to continue despite unresolved divine tension. The conflict among the gods no longer needs to be acted out. It is embedded. Each law reflects compromise. Each fate reflects a decision that could not be revisited. In this sense, fate and law are archives of conflict. They preserve outcomes long after causes are forgotten. Humanity inherits these archives without access to the debates that produced them. This inheritance shapes culture profoundly. The Sumerians become meticulous record keepers. They write contracts, laws, omens, and rituals with precision. In a world governed by fixed outcomes, knowledge becomes protection. Understanding fate does not allow one to change it, but it allows one to prepare. Understanding law does not allow one to escape it, but it allows one to navigate within it. The war's aftermath is therefore not destruction, it is containment. The cosmos is stabilized through restriction. The price of that stability is loss of intimacy, flexibility, and shared governance. The gods accept this price because the alternative is collapse. Humanity bears it because there is no alternative at all. As the narrative moves forward, the permanence of fate and law will shape how myths are remembered and misremembered. Later cultures will reinterpret these systems as expressions of divine justice or cosmic order. The original conflict that necessitated them will fade from view, but the tablets preserve enough detail to see what happened. The war did not end with peace, it ended with rules. And those rules, once written into fate and law, became the quiet legacy of a conflict that could no longer be fought openly, only endured. By the time Sumerian scribes committed their myths to clay, they were no longer writing for the gods, they were writing for the future. This is a crucial distinction that becomes clearer the deeper one moves into the later layers of the tradition. The myths cease to function as living explanations of how the world works in real time, and instead become records of what happens when order fails, when authority hardens, and when decisions can no longer be undone. They are not celebrations. They are cautions. The scribes did not frame their work as prophecy. They did not announce that they were leaving warnings behind, but the structure of the narratives reveals intent. Certain patterns are emphasized repeatedly. Certain consequences are recorded with precision. Certain moments of failure are preserved even when they reflect poorly on divine authority. This selectivity matters. In a culture where writing was laborious and sacred, nothing was recorded casually. The myths preserve memory, but not in the way later traditions would understand it. They do not preserve events so much as conditions. They show how imbalance arises, how it spreads, and how it becomes permanent when it is managed through force rather than alignment. The scribes are not trying to inspire devotion. They are trying to prevent repetition. One of the clearest warnings embedded in these texts concerns rigidity. Again and again, the myths show systems that begin with coherence and gradually harden into enforcement. What starts as structure becomes constraint. What begins as order becomes limitation. The scribes do not condemn this process outright, but they document its cost meticulously. Gods lose flexibility. Humanity loses longevity. The world loses intimacy. These losses are not framed as moral failures. They are framed as trade-offs made under pressure. By preserving this framing, the scribes ensure that later generations understand that collapse does not always arrive as chaos. Sometimes it arrives as control. Another warning lies in the portrayal of authority. Divine power is never depicted as unlimited. Even the highest gods are constrained by their own decrees. Once a word is spoken, it binds reality. This principle is repeated across genres, not to glorify authority, but to illustrate its danger. Authority that cannot revise itself becomes brittle. The scribes preserve stories where gods regret outcomes they cannot reverse. This is not accidental. It undermines the idea that power alone guarantees wisdom. By recording divine miscalculation, the myths warn human rulers who will later inherit divine authority symbolically through kingship. Kings reading these texts would see themselves reflected not in divine triumph, but in divine limitation. The implication is clear. Rule without adaptability leads to irreversible harm. The flood narrative is perhaps the most explicit example, but it is not unique. Many myths show decisions made to restore order that ultimately reduce the world's capacity to sustain life comfortably. Noise is silenced, but at the cost of abundance. Stability is achieved, but at the cost of freedom. The scribes do not frame these outcomes as success. They frame them as survival. Another warning embedded in the myths concerns distance. As the divine system hardens, gods retreat. Interaction becomes formal. Ritual replaces conversation. Law replaces relationship. This distancing protects authority from constant challenge, but it also erodes trust. The scribes preserve earlier traditions where gods walked among humans not to romanticize them but to show contrast. By placing these stories alongside later, harsher ones, they highlight what has been lost. The warning is subtle, but persistent. Distance makes order easier to enforce, but harder to justify. This warning would resonate deeply in a society where kings increasingly rule through law rather than consensus. The myths remind readers that legitimacy does not arise from enforcement alone. When authority becomes inaccessible, resentment grows beneath the surface. The Anunnaki's role reinforces this lesson. As judges of fate, they provide finality, but their finality removes appeal. Once judgment is passed, it cannot be questioned. The scribes preserve this not to glorify judgment, but to show what happens when systems rely on it exclusively. A world governed entirely by final decisions becomes predictable, but it also becomes unforgiving. Error becomes fatal. Innovation becomes risky. The scribes record this world because they live in it. The myths also warn against assuming that conflict can be eliminated. The Sumerian tradition does not imagine a return to primordial harmony. It imagines management. Conflict is not resolved. It is contained. The scribes make this clear by never providing closure. Stories do not end with peace treaties or restored unity. They end with systems in place. Fate is fixed. Law is established. The world continues. This continuation is itself the warning. Survival does not mean healing. Order does not mean harmony. The scribe's decision to preserve contradictions reinforces this message. Rather than harmonizing conflicting accounts, they copy them side by side. They allow disagreement to persist in the record. This choice communicates something important. Truth is not singular. Authority does not always agree with itself. In doing so, the scribes resist the temptation to simplify the past. They acknowledge complexity even when it undermines coherence. This honesty suggests an awareness that oversimplification is itself dangerous. The myths also warn about the cost of silence. Silent defeats, unacknowledged banishments, and unexplained disappearances recur throughout the tradition. These silences are not gaps in knowledge. They are features of a system that avoids confrontation. By preserving silence, the scribes draw attention to it. They show that what is not said can be as important as what is. Gods vanish, cities fall, reasons are omitted. The absence of explanation becomes a signal. Human readers would understand this implicitly. In a society where political shifts often occurred without public justification, silence was familiar. The myths reflect this reality back to their audience, reminding them that lack of explanation does not mean lack of cause. Another warning concerns delegation of responsibility. As authority fractures, responsibility moves downward. Humanity bears the consequences of divine decisions. Floods, plagues, and shortened lives are imposed to stabilize a system humans did not design. The scribes do not protest this arrangement, but they document it carefully. In doing so, they preserve the understanding that suffering is often structural rather than deserved. This is a dangerous insight for any ruling system. By embedding it in myth rather than doctrine, the scribes ensure its survival without overt challenge. The warning is there for those willing to see it. The preservation of law itself carries warning. Legal texts become increasingly detailed and severe, alongside mythological narratives of divine conflict. This parallel suggests awareness that law can become a substitute for wisdom rather than its expression. Precision replaces judgment. Punishment replaces understanding. The scribes record this shift without commentary, allowing readers to draw conclusions. The myths do not instruct humans to rebel. They instruct them to remember. Memory in this tradition is protective. To remember how systems fail is to reduce the likelihood of repeating those failures. The scribes act as custodians of this memory. Their work ensures that later generations know the world was not always this constrained. That fate was not always so rigid. That authority once functioned differently. This knowledge does not restore what was lost, but it contextualizes it. It prevents the present from being mistaken for the natural order of things. In this sense, the myths are not about gods at all. They're about governance, consequence, and survival under pressure. The divine setting allows these lessons to be recorded without directly criticizing human rulers. The scribes understood the power of indirection. By placing warnings in myth, they ensure that they can be repeated safely generation after generation. As the tradition moves forward, these myths become increasingly misread. Later cultures interpret them as entertainment, allegory, or superstition. The warnings fade into background noise, but the tablets themselves remain precise. They preserve sequence, consequence, and condition. They show how conflict reshapes systems until those systems become unrecognizable. The scribes were not predicting the future. They were preserving the past in a way that could still speak to it. Their myths warn that authority without flexibility leads to loss. That control without consensus produces silence rather than peace. That survival under rigid systems carries hidden costs. They also warn that once conflict is encoded into fate and law, it becomes nearly impossible to remove. The only defense is awareness. This is what the scribes were trying to preserve. Not stories of gods at war, but knowledge of how worlds change when power hardens and memory is lost. And by writing these myths, they ensured that even in a world governed by fate, something remained unfixed: the record itself. Over time, the conflict preserved in the Sumerian tablets undergoes a quiet transformation. It does not change because the texts themselves are altered, but because the context in which they are read dissolves. What began as a careful record of imbalance, authority and consequence gradually becomes something else entirely. The civil war that was never described as a war turns into a legend, and eventually into a misunderstanding layered upon another misunderstanding, each further removed from the intent of the original scribes. This transformation begins the moment the Sumerian language itself starts to fade from daily use. As Akkadian replaces it as the spoken and administrative tongue, the old tablets remain, but fewer people can read them directly. They are copied, translated, summarized, and interpreted by scribes who inherit the words, but not always the assumptions that gave those words meaning. Subtle shifts occur, not through deception, but through necessity. Sumerian myths were never written as entertainment. They were explanatory frameworks embedded in a specific worldview, one that assumed a living relationship between divine order and social structure. When that worldview weakens, the stories lose their original function. They remain compelling, but they no longer explain lived reality. Instead, they invite speculation. This is where legend begins. Later readers encounter stories of divine councils, decrees, punishments, and catastrophic outcomes without fully grasping the administrative logic behind them. The procedural nature of divine authority is no longer intuitive. What once read as governance now reads as drama. What once explained causation now appears symbolic or exaggerated. The absence of explicit battles becomes an invitation rather than a clarification. Later cultures, accustomed to framing conflict through warfare, begin to fill in gaps. Where Sumerian texts described shifts in authority, later interpretations imagine clashes. Where fate hardened quietly, later readers imagine conquest. This process accelerates as stories pass into new cultural environments. Babylonian, Assyrian, and later Greek thinkers inherit fragments of these myths and reinterpret them through their own lenses. Gods become more anthropomorphic. Conflicts become more personalized. Authority becomes more centralized or more heroic, depending on the tradition. The civil conflict that Sumerian scribes preserved as structural tension becomes narrativized. Enlil and Enki begin to resemble rivals rather than incompatible necessities. The Anunnaki begin to resemble an elite faction rather than an administrative body. Judgment becomes tyranny. Fate becomes domination. None of this requires deliberate distortion. It emerges naturally when stories outlive the systems they were meant to explain. Another layer of misunderstanding arises from the way ancient texts are categorized by modern readers. Myth, religion, history and philosophy are treated as separate domains, each with its own expectations. Sumerian writing does not conform neatly to any of these categories. A single tablet may function as theology, political theory, and social instruction simultaneously. When modern readers approach these texts expecting either literal history or symbolic myth, they miss the middle ground where Sumerian meaning resides. The civil conflict among the gods was never meant to be read as a literal war, nor as a metaphor detached from reality. It was an explanation of why authority became rigid and why life became constrained. Stripped of that context, the explanation collapses into spectacle. The misunderstanding deepens dramatically in the modern era, when ancient texts are read through the lens of conflict-driven narratives. Wars sell, battles capture attention. The idea of gods fighting appeals more readily than the idea of systems failing. As a result, the quiet complexity of the Sumerian record is flattened. The civil war becomes imagined as an event rather than a condition. This flattening is reinforced by selective reading. Passages that describe punishment, destruction, or judgment are emphasized. Passages that describe process, deliberation, or administrative strain are ignored. The result is a story that feels dramatic but loses coherence. The Anunnaki suffer the most from this shift. Their role as judges and administrators becomes reinterpreted as domination. Their association with the underworld becomes evidence of villainy rather than finality. Their collective nature is mistaken for conspiracy rather than diffusion of responsibility. Once this reinterpretation takes hold, it feeds on itself. Later writers reference earlier misunderstandings as if they were established facts. Speculation replaces philology. Assumption replaces context. The Civil War becomes a legend not because the texts say so, but because readers expect wars. Another source of misunderstanding lies in the way chronology is treated. Sumerian texts do not present events in linear narrative form. They layer traditions, repeat motifs, and revisit themes across generations. Modern readers, trained to expect chronological storytelling, attempt to reconstruct timelines that the text never intended to provide. This leads to artificial sequences. A decision recorded in one context is assumed to follow another recorded elsewhere. Cause and effect are imposed where none is stated. The result is a narrative arc that feels satisfying but lacks textual support. The original scribes did not write histories of divine conflict. They wrote records of condition. When those conditions are rearranged into story form, their meaning changes. The misunderstanding also reflects discomfort with ambiguity. The Sumerian record is unresolved by design. It does not explain everything. It does not justify every outcome. It preserves contradiction. Later cultures often find this unsatisfying. They seek closure. They want heroes and villains, beginnings and endings. In providing these, they overwrite the warning embedded in the original texts. The Civil War becomes something that happened and ended, rather than something that reshaped the world permanently. Modern interpretations amplify this tendency further. Popular culture thrives on conflict framed as spectacle. The idea of divine war aligns easily with contemporary storytelling tropes. The idea of administrative collapse does not. As a result, the most subtle and important aspects of the Sumerian worldview are lost. The relationship between authority and consequence, the danger of irreversible decisions, the cost of rigid systems. These themes are overshadowed by imagined battles. Even scholarly discourse can contribute to misunderstanding when it isolates texts from their social function. Analysing myths purely as literature strips them of their explanatory role. Analysing them purely as religion strips them of their political insight. Analysing them purely as history demands evidence they were never meant to provide. The Civil War becomes misunderstood because it resists classification. This resistance is itself meaningful. The Sumerian scribes were not interested in fitting their explanations into tidy categories. They were interested in preserving knowledge about how worlds change under pressure. When that intent is forgotten, the knowledge becomes opaque. The persistence of misunderstanding also reflects a deeper human tendency. It is easier to imagine conflict as external than to recognize it as structural. Wars fought by gods are easier to grasp than systems failing quietly. Blame assigned to individuals is easier to accept than responsibility diffused across institutions. The Sumerian texts challenge this tendency. They suggest that collapse often arrives not through attack, but through accumulation. Not through rebellion, but through rigidity. Not through enemies, but through the inability to adapt. These are uncomfortable lessons. Legends soften them. By turning the civil conflict into a misunderstood legend, later readers protect themselves from the implications of the original warning. If gods fought and won, then order was restored. If systems failed, then order must be questioned. The scribes knew this. That is why they never dramatized the conflict fully. They left it incomplete, unresolved, and embedded. They trusted future readers to notice the pattern. Many did not. Instead, the legend grows. The Anunnaki become warriors. Councils become battlefields. Fate becomes conquest. The war becomes something that happened long ago, safely concluded. This reinterpretation is comforting. It allows readers to admire the past without confronting its relevance. Yet the tablets themselves remain unchanged. They continue to record punishments without explanation, laws without mercy, fate without appeal. They continue to show a world governed by systems that hardened under pressure. The civil war, as preserved by the scribes, never ended. It became structure. Understanding this requires resisting the pull of legend. It requires reading slowly, comparing versions, noticing omissions, and accepting ambiguity. When this effort is made, the misunderstanding begins to dissolve. The war is no longer a story about gods fighting. It is a story about authority failing to remain flexible, about systems adapting through restriction, about survival achieved at a cost. This is not a satisfying legend. It does not offer triumph. It does not promise resolution. It offers recognition. The Sumerian scribes did not expect their work to be read easily. They expected it to endure. The misunderstanding of the civil war is therefore not a failure of the texts. It is a measure of how far readers have drifted from the conditions those texts describe. As the narrative moves toward its final reflection, what remains is not the question of whether the gods fought, but why the world that followed looks the way it does. The answer is not hidden in battle scenes or heroic deeds. It is written into fate, law, and silence. The legend obscures that writing. The tablets preserve it. And for those willing to read them as the scribes intended, the civil war stops being a myth about the past and becomes a mirror held quietly against the present. As the Sumerian record draws towards silence rather than resolution, it leaves behind not an ending, but a condition. The gods do not reconcile. Authority does not return to its original balance. The world does not heal back into the form it once held. Instead, existence settles into a pattern shaped by decisions that could not be undone and disagreements that could not be spoken aloud. This is the quiet state the tablets describe, and it is here that their meaning becomes most enduring. When even gods cannot agree, the universe does not collapse. It adapts. This adaptation is not gentle. It is not generous. It is careful, restrained, and increasingly narrow. The cosmos learns how to function without harmony by replacing it with procedure. Fate stands where dialogue once existed. Law stands where trust once operated. Distance stands where presence once felt natural. The Sumerian scribes do not dramatize this outcome. They do not frame it as tragedy or failure. They record it with the same steady precision they apply to lists of kings, offerings, and rituals. This steadiness is itself revealing. The world they inhabit has already accepted this condition as normal. The gods remain powerful. Their authority is unquestioned. Yet their power feels different. It no longer flows outward through shared purpose. It presses downward through systems that allow no appeal. The distance between intention and outcome grows wider. The distance between heaven and earth becomes fixed. This distance protects the system. It also isolates it. Heaven maintains legitimacy but withdraws from explanation. Earth enforces order but loses flexibility. The underworld provides finality but offers no comfort. Together these realms form a stable structure, but one that no longer relies on agreement to function. Agreement has become unnecessary. Compliance is sufficient. Humanity lives entirely within this structure. From birth, humans inherit fate, law, and limitation. These are not framed as punishments. They are framed as conditions. Life is short. Labour is required. Ritual must be precise. Deviation carries consequence. The world continues because it must. What the tablets preserve, quietly and persistently, is the understanding that this condition did not arise naturally. It emerged from unresolved tension at the highest level of authority. The gods did not design a harsh world intentionally. They accepted it as the only world that could continue once flexibility was lost. This acceptance shapes everything that follows. Memory becomes cautious. Innovation becomes dangerous. Stability becomes the highest value. Yet beneath this stability, something remains unsettled. The myths never close the circle. They never say that order was fully restored. They never claim that fate is just, only that it is fixed. They never promise that law reflects wisdom, only that it enforces survival. This refusal to conclude is deliberate. The scribes understood that when systems harden, the most dangerous thing is forgetting that they were once different. By preserving earlier traditions alongside later ones, by allowing contradictions to stand, they leave behind a record of change without commentary. The reader is left to notice. In a world where even gods cannot agree, certainty becomes suspect. Authority persists, but it is no longer self-evident. It must be maintained, reinforced, and ritualized. Silence becomes a tool. Finality becomes a solution. This is not cynicism. It is observation. The Sumerians did not imagine their gods as perfect beings ruling effortlessly. They imagined them as powerful forces constrained by the systems they created. Once those systems grew too rigid, even divine power could not restore what was lost. This insight is embedded everywhere in the record, in the shortening of lifespans, in the formalization of death, in the disappearance of direct divine speech, in the rise of judges instead of intermediaries. The Anunnaki stand as the clearest symbol of this condition. They are not villains. They are not conquerors. They are the form authority takes when agreement is no longer possible. Judgment replaces governance. Fate replaces dialogue. Their presence ensures continuity, but it also confirms loss. The world that follows the divine conflict is orderly, but it is not generous. It functions, but it does not invite. It endures, but it does not explain itself. Humanity adapts because it has no alternative. The gods themselves adapt as well. They rule from a distance. They allow systems to operate on their behalf. Their direct involvement becomes rare, measured, and often indirect. Power becomes less personal and more absolute. This is the final quiet truth the tablets leave behind. Disagreement at the highest level does not destroy the world. It reshapes it into something colder, more controlled, and more predictable. The scribes did not write this to frighten. They wrote it to preserve awareness. Awareness that harmony is fragile. Awareness that authority without flexibility produces permanence, not peace. Awareness that systems designed to survive conflict often outlive the reasons they were created. In this preserved awareness lies the enduring relevance of the Sumerian record. It does not ask for belief. It does not demand interpretation. It simply shows what happens. When even gods cannot agree, the universe does not choose sides loudly. It chooses constraint quietly. It trades openness for order. It trades intimacy for endurance. And once that trade is made, it becomes difficult to remember that another way ever existed. The tablets do not tell us how to reverse this condition. They do not suggest that harmony can be restored. They do not promise renewal. They record adaptation and leave the rest unspoken. This unspoken space is intentional. It is where reflection occurs. Not reflection in the form of instructional warning, but reflection in the form of recognition. Recognition that the world we inherit is shaped by decisions made long before us. Recognition that systems harden when flexibility fails. Recognition that survival often requires sacrifice that cannot be undone. The Sumerians understood that memory itself was a form of resistance against complete normalization. To remember that the world changed is to resist believing it was always this way. So the record ends not with judgment, not with triumph, and not with collapse, but with continuation. The gods remain. Humanity persists. Fate holds. Law stands. The conflict that shaped this world does not resolve. It settles. And in that settled state the tablets rest, waiting quietly, offering no answers, only the shape of a truth that does not need to be spoken aloud to remain present.